If you are listening to this right now, tell me where you are tuning in from and what time it is. She whispered a chilling truth. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Those are the dramatic reactions people like Margaret actively feed on. Instead, I slowly bent down. The polished marble floor was freezing against my bare knees, a sharp contrast to the burning heat flushing across my face. My fingers brushed the smooth silk of the navy scarf. It was a beautiful piece, custom-made to drape perfectly over the uneven, discolored skin that ran from my collarbone down to my left shoulder. I picked it up. I didn't rush. I didn't scramble like a frightened animal trying to escape a predator. I simply held the fabric tightly in my fist and stood back up. The silence in the massive room was suffocating. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on the jagged, raised lines of my burn scars. I could see the polite pity in some faces, the morbid curiosity in others. But I didn't look at them. I looked straight at Stephen. He was standing less than 10 feet away. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. His hand was firmly wrapped around a crystal glass of expensive bourbon. He absolutely refused to meet my eyes. He was looking at a floral arrangement, at the floor, anywhere but at his wife. The man who had vowed to protect me had just watched his mother publicly strip away my dignity, and his only response was to tell me to hide. That was the exact moment the grand illusion shattered. Margaret's cruelty was expected. She had always been a bitter, status-obsessed woman who viewed me as an ugly stain on her family's perfect aesthetic. But Stephen's silence, that was a betrayal that cut much deeper than any physical wound I had ever endured. He wasn't just being passive. He was making a distinct choice. By doing nothing, he was standing right beside her. I realized then that I had spent years trying to warm a house that was fundamentally built on ice. I had poured my heart, my endless patience, and my money into a man who would rather let me be publicly humiliated than endure a 5-minute argument with his mother. I didn't say a single word. I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy oak double doors leading out of the ballroom. I kept my posture straight, my shoulders pushed back. I walked with the disciplined stride of a woman who had survived far worse than a mean-spirited socialite. The heavy doors closed behind me, muting the sudden eruption of whispers from the ballroom. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by crystal sconces. The air conditioning hummed gently, blowing cool air against my exposed scars. I leaned against the patterned wallpaper, finally allowing myself to take a deep, shaky breath. The adrenaline was slowly fading, leaving behind a cold, heavy clarity. I wasn't just sad, I was completely awake. I started walking toward the guest suites to gather my things. I was done. Someone was following me. I turned around quickly, my muscles tensing out of pure habit. But it wasn't Stephen coming to whisper a hollow apology. And it certainly wasn't Margaret coming to finish the job. It was Robert. He was 12 years old, swimming in a rented tuxedo that was slightly too big for his thin, fragile frame. Robert was Stephen's younger half-brother, Assisi's uncle by blood, but he was treated like a ghost by everyone else. Ever since his own mother passed away a few years ago, the boy had struggled with severe anxiety. Margaret viewed his terrifying panic attacks not as a desperate cry for help, but as an unforgivable social embarrassment. She openly called him defective. She hid him in back rooms whenever important guests came over. Right now, he was trembling. His small hands clutched a glass of iced water. He took a hesitant step forward, his wide brown eyes darting down the dark hallway as if expecting Margaret to jump out from the shadows at any second. I immediately softened. I knelt down on the plush carpet, bringing myself down to his eye level. I didn't try to hide my shoulder. I didn't pull the silk scarf over my skin to protect his feelings. He stepped closer and held out the glass. His hands were shaking so badly the ice clinked loudly against the rim. He didn't say anything, but the quiet offering was incredibly clear. He had seen exactly what happened in that glamorous ballroom. He had seen the vicious monster his family could be. and instead of running away, he had followed me out into the dark. I took the glass, making sure to brush his knuckles gently. "Thank you, Robert," I said, keeping my voice very low and steady. He didn't look away from my scars. The burns were angry and red under the harsh hallway lights, a roadmap of a terrible day I rarely spoke about. Most adults stared with polite horror. Margaret stared with open disgust. But Robert just looked at them with a quiet, profound understanding. To him, they weren't ugly. They were just proof that I had survived something terrible. He knew a whole lot about surviving terrible things inside that massive, lonely house. "She is mean," he whispered, his voice barely a squeak. "Margaret is very mean." "I know, buddy. I know she is," I replied, setting the glass on a nearby wooden console table. I reached out and pulled him into a gentle hug. He was stiff for a brief second, then completely melted against me, burying his face in my neck. His small shoulders hitched as he took shallow, panicky breaths. I rubbed his back in slow, rhythmic circles. This was the only real family I had actually found in Newport. While Stephen and Margaret obsessed over designer labels and country club invitations, Robert and I had spent countless evenings sitting on the floor of the library, doing complex puzzles in comfortable silence. He was the one pure thing in a house built entirely on lies. Holding him, I felt a new kind of fierce resolve settle into my bones. Heavy footsteps approached us. I instinctively tightened my arm around Robert, shielding his small body. But as the tall figure stepped under the bright light of a crystal chandelier, my tense shoulders instantly dropped. It was Nolan, my father. He was a retired state judge, a man who possessed the kind of quiet, imposing authority that could silence a chaotic courtroom without ever raising a wooden gavel. He wore a crisp navy suit, standing incredibly tall despite his 70 years. He didn't rush toward me with dramatic gasps or tearful, useless apologies. He simply walked over, his sharp eyes taking in the entire scene, the trembling boy, the discarded silk scarf in my hand, and the exposed, scarred tissue on my shoulder. He knew exactly what had happened. Seeing him standing there abruptly pulled my mind back to a chilly Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago. I was sitting in his dark, oak-paneled home office, the smell of old paper and leather heavy in the quiet air. On the desk between us sat a massive, intimidating stack of legal documents. I had just told him about Stephen's failing shipping company, about the crushing debt, and my firm intention to wire $450,000 of my own money to save his fleet. Stephen had wept. He had promised it was just a temporary loan, swearing that we were a team. I was ready to just write the massive check. But my father had placed his large, weathered hand flat over the papers. He looked at me with the same intense, analytical gaze he always used on the judicial bench. "Celeste," he had said, his voice deep and completely uncompromising, "you are walking into a burning building for a man who hasn't proven he knows how to hold a hose. If you are going to do this, we do it my way." He had personally drafted a promissory note, not a simple piece of paper, but an ironclad contract. It contained a very specific acceleration clause, tied to strict behavioral covenants. It meant if they ever crossed a legal or moral line, the debt would come due instantly. "Law doesn't believe in love," he had told me, tapping the signature line with a heavy gold pen. "It doesn't care about whispered promises in the dark. It only believes in signatures. Keep this file safe. There will come a day when you need it." I had thought he was being overly cynical. I had signed it anyway, never truly believing Stephen or Margaret would push me to actually use it. Now, staring at my father in the hallway of the Newport estate, I realized he hadn't been cynical at all. He had been entirely prophetic. Nolan stopped right in front of me. He looked down at Robert, giving the boy a small, reassuring nod that seemed to calm the child's racing heart. Then, he unbuttoned his suit jacket. With deliberate, measured care, he draped the heavy wool fabric over my shoulders, covering the scars Margaret had tried to turn into a public spectacle. The jacket felt like absolute armor. He looked at me. "Are you finally ready to truly understand why I didn't just walk away from Stephen's toxic family years ago? You have to understand where I came from. Before the sprawling Newport mansions, before the charity galas and the endless designer clothes, I was a search and rescue helicopter pilot. I spent my demanding days flying into aggressive storms, pulling stranded hikers off dangerous mountainsides and plucking terrified sailors from raging, unpredictable seas. It was a stressful job that demanded absolute perfection, and for a very long time, I was incredibly good at it. Then came the terrible accident. We were hovering over a capsized fishing boat during a massive coastal squall. The wind sheared violently, slamming our delicate tail rotor into a rogue wave. The sudden crash was deafening. I somehow managed to drag 4 people out of the burning, rapidly sinking wreckage before the fuel tank ignited. The massive blast caught my left side. The medics said it was a miracle I lived. 4 people went home to their grateful families that night because of me. But my brave co-pilot didn't make it. The severe burns healed over years of painful, agonizing surgeries, leaving behind thick, corded scars that stretched across my collarbone and shoulder. But the invisible scars were much worse. Psychologists call it survivor's guilt. It is a quiet, insidious poison that silently infects everything. When you walk away from a tragedy that someone else didn't, your brain starts playing cruel tricks on you. You start to feel like you don't truly deserve the life you kept. You begin to systematically lower your basic standards for happiness, accepting the absolute bare minimum of love and respect. Deep down, a dark, relentless part of you whispers that you shouldn't even be here, so you should just be grateful for whatever tiny scraps you get. That was exactly the fragile, damaged mindset I was in when I first met Stephen. He was undeniably charming, supposedly wealthy, and deeply, fundamentally broken. His family's generations-old shipping empire was already showing massive financial cracks, and he was constantly crumbling under the heavy pressure of his mother's impossible expectations. My professionally trained instincts saw a man drowning in a storm, and I did what I always did. I immediately dove in to save him. I blindly accepted his emotional unavailability because I incorrectly thought my physical scars made me unlovable. I tolerated Margaret's endless snide remarks about my humble background because I felt inexplicably lucky just to be included in their glittering world. I viewed fixing their dysfunctional, chaotic lives as my brand new rescue mission. I genuinely thought that if I just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough of myself, and stayed quiet enough, I could finally earn my place at their table. I could finally justify my own survival. It is a profoundly terrifying thing to look in the mirror and realize that you have allowed your own past trauma to turn you into a willing victim. I had forged my own invisible chains. I had freely handed Stephen and Margaret the heavy keys to my entire self-worth, and they had spent years happily locking me away in the dark. Standing in that hallway with my father's heavy wool jacket draped over my shoulders, those chains finally snapped. I was absolutely done paying a debt to the universe that I simply didn't owe. I remembered my very first day. I remembered the first time I walked into the grand Newport estate. It was a sprawling, 3-story mansion with sweeping, breathtaking views of the Atlantic, perfectly manicured hedges, and a long driveway lined with imported sports cars. To the outside world, it was an intimidating fortress of untouchable generational wealth. Inside, it was a fragile house of cards just waiting for a strong breeze. Margaret was the undisputed, ruthless queen of this fragile castle. She was a woman who measured human value entirely by brand names and exclusive country club memberships. From the very moment Stephen introduced me, her deep disapproval was palpable. She looked at my practical shoes and my unpolished nails with thinly veiled disgust. To her, I was just an outsider, a lowly commoner who had somehow snuck past the velvet rope. "Oh, Celeste is so delightfully rustic," Margaret would loudly say at her high society tea parties, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she poured hot tea into fine, delicate china cups. She actually works with her bare hands. It's so remarkably quaint. The other wealthy, impeccably dressed wives would laugh softly, their massive diamonds glinting brightly in the sunlight. I would just sit there quietly, sipping my tea, burying my burning anger under a polite, frozen smile. Stephen never once defended me. He would just squeeze my knee gently under the table, his silent, pathetic plea for me to keep the peace. I quickly realized my actual role in the family. I wasn't a beloved wife or a cherished daughter-in-law. I was a well-funded, highly convenient guest. Thanks to my military pension, hazard pay, and a significant medical settlement from my helicopter crash, I had a very comfortable financial nest egg, and in a family where appearance was absolutely everything and cash was secretly incredibly scarce. My financial stability made me a very convenient asset. Stephen was the supposed heir to a massive shipping empire, but the reality was far grim. His late father had made terrible, reckless investments before passing away, and Stephen severely lacked the spine to make the tough, unpopular decisions needed to save the business. He spent his aimless days attending lavish luncheons and playing endless rounds of golf, desperately pretending the financial rot wasn't rapidly spreading through the floorboards. Assisi, his 22-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, was a perfect, miniature replica of Margaret. She treated me like a personal assistant, constantly expecting me to cheerfully fund her lavish shopping trips and silently cover her maxed-out credit card bills whenever Stephen's accounts were mysteriously frozen. If I ever dared to say no, the entire house would deliberately treat me to agonizing days of icy silence until I finally caved. I swept their messes under the expensive rug and paid the hidden invoices to keep the shiny facade intact. I foolishly convinced myself that my financial contributions were earning their genuine love. But a carefully constructed facade can only hold up for so long before gravity eventually takes over. The grand illusion of their untouchable wealth finally shattered on a cold, rainy Tuesday morning. The creditors had finally arrived. While Stephen and Margaret spent their endless days meticulously maintaining the fragile illusion of their elite status, I found my actual purpose hidden in the quietest corners of that massive estate. My genuine connection in that house didn't come from extravagant dinner parties or forced family portraits. It came entirely from a terrified 12-year-old boy who had been casually discarded by his own blood. Robert was essentially a ghost in his own home. Margaret treated his severe anxiety as a personal insult to her flawless genetic line. Whenever wealthy guests arrived, she would seamlessly orchestrate his removal, sending him up to his room with strict instructions to remain completely invisible. She never bothered to ask why he was shaking or why he stared blankly at the walls. She just wanted the inconvenient problem hidden away. I couldn't look away. My years in search and rescue had deeply trained me to run directly toward people in distress, not away from them. I started spending my evenings sitting quietly on the thick wool carpet of his bedroom floor. During his worst panic attacks, when his small chest would heave and he couldn't catch his breath, I didn't coddle him with empty, meaningless platitudes. I used the exact same grounding techniques I used on terrified survivors sitting in the back of my loud helicopter. I would hold his hand, making him count the steady beats of my pulse. I taught him how to anchor his mind to the solid floor beneath us. I spent countless sleepless nights sitting by his bed, reading thick encyclopedias about marine biology out loud until his breathing finally leveled out. We built incredibly complex model ships on the library floor, working in a comfortable, healing silence that the rest of the loud, chaotic house severely lacked. I never tried to replace his late mother. I never forced him to call me anything other than my first name. I just showed up, day after day, consistently proving that he was entirely worthy of being seen. Love doesn't always require a biological connection to take deep root. Sometimes love is just the simple, profound act of staying in the room when everyone else has chosen to walk out. Slowly, the terrified ghost of a boy began to fade. He started smiling. He started leaving his room without being asked. He even started holding my hand when we walked through the sprawling gardens. I had successfully pulled him from the wreckage of his own grief. He was safe. But the adults in the house were actively plunging into a completely different kind of disaster. The carefully constructed financial facade was finally cracking under the immense weight of their reckless, unchecked spending. The endless, desperate phone calls from the bank became impossible to ignore. The heavy tension in the hallways grew so thick it was hard to breathe. One rainy Tuesday night, the storm finally broke inside the house. Glass shattered in the library. I hurried down the grand staircase, my bare feet silent against the cold hardwood steps. The heavy mahogany door to Stephen's private library was slightly ajar. Inside, the heavy scent of spilled bourbon and bitter despair hung thickly in the air. Stephen was slumped heavily in his expensive leather chair, his face buried deep in his hands. A crystal decanter lay shattered against the stone fireplace, glistening sharply in the dim light. He looked nothing like the confident, wealthy heir he diligently portrayed at the country club. He looked exactly like a terrified, cornered animal. The shipping empire was officially collapsing. He had spent the last 3 years desperately moving money around, taking out reckless, high-interest loans to cover the massive operational deficits his late father had left behind. But the aggressive shell game was finally over. The primary bank was threatening to seize the entire fleet by the end of the month. If the ships went, the Newport estate would quickly follow. The family would be publicly ruined. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and swimming with pathetic tears. He didn't try to hide his massive failure. Instead, he weaponized it. He knew exactly how to trigger my deepest psychological vulnerabilities. He expertly played the desperate victim, sobbing about how he had failed Robert, how he would lose the only home the boy had ever known. "I don't know how to fix this," he choked out, his voice cracking perfectly. "If we lose the fleet, Margaret will absolutely fall apart. Robert will lose his doctors, his stability. Everything we built is entirely gone. I have completely failed you." It was a masterful, manipulative performance. He didn't ask me for a single dime directly. He just painted a vivid, terrifying picture of our family being thrown out into the cold, relying entirely on my deeply ingrained instinct to save the day. He knew I had received a massive financial settlement from the military after my devastating helicopter crash. He knew I had hazard pay safely tucked away in quiet investment accounts. He wept, swearing that he just needed a temporary bridge. He promised that if we could just clear the immediate debt, the upcoming international contracts would easily make us completely whole again. He swore he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me and Robert. I stood there in the quiet library, looking at this broken man. My analytical brain quietly pointed out all the massive red flags. But the damaged, guilty part of my soul, the part that desperately wanted to prove I was worthy of a family, screamed far louder. I genuinely believed that if I saved his legacy, I would finally cement my place in his heart. I believed that love meant catching the people you care about when they are falling, no matter the personal cost. I made my silent choice. I didn't ask for a parade. I didn't demand a grand, tearful thank you from Margaret, nor did I want my name carved into the side of a cargo ship. I operated exactly as I had in the military, identify the critical crisis, execute the difficult solution, and walk away without expecting applause. The very next morning, I drove my practical sedan to the large wealth management firm downtown. I sat in a pristine, glass-walled office and methodically liquidated my primary investment portfolios. I stared at the dense paperwork detailing my medical settlement. That money was literally paid for in blood, burns, and the tragic loss of my brave co-pilot. It was my absolute security blanket. It was the only tangible safety net I had ever known. I signed the heavy authorization forms without allowing my hand to tremble. I initiated a direct, irrevocable wire transfer of $450,000 to the primary holding account of Stephen's shipping firm. It was enough to completely clear the aggressive banking liens. It was enough to stop the impending foreclosure and buy the failing company the critical breathing room it desperately needed to secure the new overseas contracts. I had effectively pulled their entire legacy back from the absolute brink of total annihilation. When I brought the stamped bank confirmation receipt back to the estate, Stephen pulled me into a desperate, crushing hug. He cried into my shoulder, repeatedly whispering that I was his savior. He swore, with absolute conviction, that the money would be fully repaid within 2 years. He promised that our marriage would be stronger, that Margaret would finally see my true value, and that we would build a beautiful life together. I wanted so badly to believe the beautiful lie. I quietly tucked the bank records away in a locked drawer. For a fleeting, fragile moment, the oppressive tension in the Newport mansion actually lifted. Stephen went back to work with renewed, frantic energy. The aggressive phone calls from the bank completely stopped. Margaret continued hosting her lavish afternoon teas, blissfully unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant of the fact that the fine china she was pouring from technically belonged to the woman she openly despised. I went back to sitting on the floor with Robert, quietly helping him with his schoolwork and managing his therapy appointments. I didn't throw my massive financial sacrifice in anyone's face. I genuinely thought my silent loyalty was actively building an unbreakable foundation of mutual respect. I thought family protected family. But gratitude has an incredibly short memory when it comes to entitled people. The relief quickly morphed back into the same old quiet arrogance. Stephen stopped mentioning the repayment plan. Margaret snide, cutting remarks about my unrefined background, slowly crept right back into her daily vocabulary. The massive financial rescue simply became an unspoken, buried secret. 3 long years slowly passed. 3 years after the massive bailout, the shipping company was technically afloat, but it was nowhere near the roaring financial success Stephen had desperately promised. Cash flow was still incredibly tight, tightly restricted by operational costs, and Stephen's poor management. Yet, you would never know it by looking at Assisi. Assisi was 22, freshly graduated from an expensive private university, and newly engaged to a wealthy real estate developer. She was Margaret's absolute golden child, trained from birth to value aesthetic perfection above all else. When it came to her wedding, the word budget was treated like a foul insult. She demanded a royal spectacle. She wanted the ceremony held on the sprawling back lawn of our Newport estate, complete with a custom-built, glass-paneled conservatory that overlooked the crashing ocean. She wanted thousands of rare, imported orchids flown in from Holland. She demanded a Michelin-starred catering team and a 12-piece symphony orchestra to play as she walked down the aisle. Stephen spent his evenings hiding in his library again, rubbing his temples as the massive vendor invoices rapidly piled up on his antique desk. He was completely terrified of telling Margaret and Assisi no, admitting they couldn't easily afford $250,000 for a single party meant admitting the grim financial truth to their elite social circle. It meant profound public embarrassment. We just need to scale it back, I suggested calmly one evening, watching him stare blankly at a ridiculous quote for custom velvet napkins. Assisi will still have a beautiful day. We cannot put the company back into debt for a party. Assisi overheard me from the hallway. She stormed into the library, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated entitlement. She didn't look at her father. She glared directly at me, her eyes sweeping over my practical sweater with complete disdain. "We are not scaling back," she snapped aggressively. "This is my wedding. It reflects on our entire family. But I wouldn't expect someone like you to understand high society standards. You've never cared about how things actually look." Stephen didn't say a word to correct her. He didn't remind his vicious daughter that the only reason she still had a luxurious roof over her head was because of my money. He simply looked down at the desk, choosing his own comfort over basic human decency. Margaret quickly glided into the room, placing a supportive hand on Assisi's shoulder, shooting me a look of cold, absolute triumph. They were fully prepared to drive the family right back into a financial ditch just to maintain their fake, glittering facade. The sheer audacity of their greed was genuinely suffocating. I watched the three of them huddle together, a perfect toxic unit that I was clearly never going to be a real part of. I had to fix it. I knew exactly what would happen if I didn't intervene. Stephen would quietly take out another high-interest, predatory loan to cover Assisi's extravagant wedding demands. The heavy stress would eventually crush the fragile shipping business again, and the entire toxic cycle of desperate tears and impending bankruptcy would violently repeat itself. I couldn't let that happen, primarily because of Robert. He needed a stable home, not a financial war zone. So, I made my second massive mistake. I agreed to fully fund Assisi's wedding and establish a solid financial baseline for her new married life. I committed $250,000 from my remaining heavily guarded retirement funds. But this time, I didn't just quietly wire the cash. My father, Nolan, had somehow caught wind of the impending disaster. He drove down from Boston, his presence immediately lowering the temperature in the chaotic Newport house. He sat me down in the dining room and refused to leave until I handed him the financial reins. "I warned you 3 years ago," Nolan said, his voice entirely devoid of judgment, but heavy with absolute authority. "You are dealing with bottomless pits. If you insist on throwing more money into the dark, we are putting a heavy steel lid on it." Nolan meticulously drafted a formal legal trust. The $250,000 would be strictly managed. It would seamlessly cover the massive wedding vendors directly, ensuring Assisi couldn't just pocket the cash for frivolous luxuries, and the remainder would sit in a locked account meant strictly for a home down payment. But Nolan didn't stop there. He masterfully linked this new trust directly to the original promissory note I had signed 3 years ago. He updated the aggressive acceleration clause. He tied the entire $700,000 total debt to a very specific, undeniable moral turpitude covenant. It explicitly stated that any severe public defamation, abuse, or moral breach against the lender me would trigger immediate, full repayment of both the original loan and the new trust funds. "They won't sign this," I had whispered, staring at the dense legal jargon. "They will," Nolan replied coldly, sliding the pen across the table. "Because arrogant people never actually believe the rules apply to them. They only see the free money." He was absolutely right. Stephen blindly signed the documents without even reading the specific clauses, just deeply relieved that the crushing wedding bills were finally paid. Margaret actually smiled and graciously offered to sign as a formal witness, totally convinced it was just standard banking bureaucracy. They eagerly took the money, entirely oblivious to the heavy, ironclad trap they had just happily walked right into. I foolishly thought the massive financial gift would finally buy me genuine peace. I thought funding Assisi's dream would finally earn me a sliver of basic respect. The ungrateful whispers started immediately. You cannot buy genuine respect from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. Within mere weeks of signing the massive trust documents, the toxic atmosphere in the Newport estate didn't improve at all. In fact, it grew significantly more hostile. Margaret didn't view my $250,000 contribution as an incredible act of familial generosity. She viewed it as a direct, aggressive threat to her absolute authority. To her twisted mind, my ability to effortlessly fund a royal-tier wedding highlighted her own severe financial impotence. She couldn't handle the bitter truth that the ugly outsider held the heavy purse strings of her beloved dynasty. So, she immediately started actively controlling the narrative. During her exclusive country club luncheons and charity galas, she began dropping subtle, venomous hints to the other elite wives. She spun a ridiculous, entirely fabricated story. She heavily implied that I was using my pension money to aggressively control Stephen. She painted me as a deeply insecure, manipulative woman who was desperately trying to buy a family because my terrible scars made me completely unlovable to anyone else. "It's so sad, really," Margaret would sigh, adjusting her diamond necklace. "Stephen stays out of pure pity. She throws her little savings around just to feel relevant. We let her help with the wedding because she needs to feel useful." I heard the cruel rumors echoing back to me through the hired household staff. The profound injustice of it burned incredibly hot in my chest. I had quietly sacrificed my literal blood money to save them from total public ruin, and they were actively using my quiet dignity as a weapon against me. They took my absolute silence as confirmation of my profound weakness. Stephen did exactly what he always did, absolutely nothing. He heard the vicious rumors. He knew his mother was actively assassinating my character to protect her own fragile ego. But confronting her required a spine he simply didn't possess. He just kept his head down, heavily pouring himself another expensive glass of bourbon, fully content to let me be the family scapegoat as long as his bank accounts remained comfortably full. I slowly stopped trying. I stopped trying to engage in polite conversation at the dinner table. I stopped trying to earn a place in a family that was completely morally bankrupt. I retreated to the quiet corners of the massive estate, focusing entirely on Robert's steady progress and my own quiet peace. I convinced myself that I could endure the cold isolation, as long as the boy was safe. I thought the worst was finally over. I thought we had reached a miserable, yet stable, emotional stalemate. The wedding morning finally arrived. "Are you finally ready?" my father had asked, his heavy wool jacket warm against my exposed, scarred shoulder. Before I could even formulate a proper answer, the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom cracked open again. A young woman slipped out into the dimly lit hallway, looking absolutely terrified. It was Elena, one of Assisi's bridesmaids. She was visibly shivering in her expensive, pale pink chiffon dress, clutching her sparkling silver handbag like it was a life preserver. She didn't walk toward the guest restrooms. She walked directly toward me. I stiffened, fully expecting another messenger sent by Margaret to ensure I had properly vanished. But Elena didn't look arrogant or dismissive. She looked deeply, profoundly sick to her stomach. She glanced nervously back at the closed ballroom doors before stopping a few feet away from my father and me. "Celeste," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "I am so incredibly sorry. I didn't know they were going to do that. I swear I didn't." I frowned, keeping my posture entirely straight. "You didn't know what, Elena?" She swallowed hard, tears welling up in her eyes. She unclasped her silver handbag with trembling fingers and pulled out her smartphone. The screen was brightly glowing. "I left my phone in the main bridal suite this morning," Elena explained, her voice cracking under the intense pressure. "I was trying to record a time-lapse video of all of us getting our makeup done. I completely forgot about it and left it running on the vanity for over an hour. When I finally went back to get it, I listened to the audio." She looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. The heavy silence in the hallway felt suddenly toxic. My father, Nolan, stepped slightly closer, his protective instincts instantly flaring. Robert gripped the fabric of my dress, sensing the sudden shift in the air. "You need to hear what happened after I left the room," Elena whispered. "They didn't just snap at you out there. It wasn't an accident." She held the phone out to me. Her hand was shaking so badly I had to steady it with my own. I looked down at the bright screen. There was a single audio file paused right in the middle of a lengthy recording. My chest tightened painfully, but my military training kicked in, overriding the rising panic. I took a slow, deep breath. My thumb pressed play. At first, there was nothing but the chaotic ambient noise of the bridal suite. The clinking of champagne glasses, the rustling of heavy silk dresses, and the distant, muffled sound of a hairdryer. Then, Margaret's unmistakable, haughty voice cut sharply through the static. "Today is finally the day," she said, her tone dripping with vicious anticipation. A few women in the background laughed nervously. Someone asked her what she meant. I am entirely sick of looking at her walking around my house like she owns the place. Margaret spat maliciously. If she insists on wearing that hideous, cheap scarf in our official family portraits, I'm going to rip it right off her neck in front of everyone. Let her high society friends see the disgusting monster Stephen actually married. She will be so deeply humiliated, she'll pack her bags and leave before the cake is even cut. Someone in the audio gasped loudly. "Margaret, you can't do that in front of all these guests. Stephen will be furious." "Oh, please." Margaret laughed, a cold, grating sound. "Stephen doesn't care about her. He just cares about the bank accounts." My blood turned to absolute ice. The sheer, calculated malice in her voice was physically nauseating. But the recording wasn't over. A heavy door clicked open on the audio track. Heavy, familiar footsteps entered the room. "Mother, keep your voice down," Stephen muttered. "Did you hear my plan, darling?" Margaret asked sweetly. I stopped breathing. I stood in the quiet hallway, staring at the glowing phone, waiting for my husband to defend me. I waited for the man who had cried on my shoulder, the man whose massive debts I had cleared with my own blood money, to finally stand up and shut his mother down. Instead, Stephen sighed heavily. "I heard you. Just don't do it before a CC's solo pictures. I really don't want to deal with a massive crying scene ruining the aesthetic. Let her run off. I'll handle the financial fallout later." The audio abruptly ended. Nobody in the hallway moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was somehow 1,000 times louder than the agonizing recording had been. The brutal betrayal didn't just sting, it completely hollowed me out. Stephen hadn't just been a coward in the ballroom. He had known about the public execution beforehand. He had approved it. He had essentially signed off on my total humiliation just to avoid an uncomfortable argument. Elena was openly crying now. She mumbled another desperate apology and practically ran down the hallway, unable to face the devastating wreckage she had just handed me. I slowly handed the phone back to empty air, almost dropping it. My father smoothly caught it. He didn't offer a single useless word of comfort. He just watched my face. My marriage was dead. There is a very specific, quiet moment when a marriage finally dies. It doesn't always happen during a screaming match, and it doesn't always happen with a dramatic slamming door. For me, it happened in the absolute, sterile silence of a Newport mansion hallway, staring at the blank screen of a borrowed smartphone. All the heavy, suffocating chains of my survivor's guilt instantly vanished. The pathetic, nagging voice in my head that had spent years whispering I was too damaged, too scarred, and too unlovable to demand basic respect was completely silenced. It was replaced by the cold, calculating clarity of a pilot who suddenly realizes the engines have failed and the only option left is to aggressively brace for impact. I wasn't a savior. I wasn't a cherished family member. I was a heavily funded ATM that they had decided to brutally smash open. Stephen's pathetic whining on that audio recording echoed endlessly in my mind. I'll handle the financial fallout later. He honestly believed that because I had endured their quiet abuse for 3 long years, I would just swallow this massive, public indignity too. He thought I would run away in tears, pack my bags, and leave my money comfortably sitting in their bank accounts. He vastly underestimated the woman he had married. If you've ever had someone you trusted stand by and watch you get hurt, type yes in the comments. Let's see how many of us have survived this. I looked down at Robert. The poor boy was staring at me, his brown eyes wide with deep, empathetic sorrow. He had lived in this toxic snake pit his entire life. He knew exactly what it felt like to be casually discarded by the people who were biologically supposed to protect him. I squeezed his small hand, silently promising him that the cycle of abuse ended today. I turned to my father. Nolan was watching me with intense, unwavering focus. He had been quietly waiting for this exact moment for 3 long years. He had known, long before I ever did, that the fragile glass house would eventually shatter. "You were right," I said, my voice completely stripped of any emotion. It wasn't sad. It wasn't angry. It was just an undeniable, chilling fact. The law doesn't believe in love. Nolan gave a slow, deliberate nod. He didn't smile, but a glint of fierce, judicial satisfaction flashed in his dark eyes. He reached down and picked up the heavy, black leather briefcase he had set on the floor. He placed it on the console table. The metallic snap of the brass locks echoed loudly down the empty hallway. "Let's review our arsenal," he said. The briefcase opened perfectly. Nolan carefully lifted the lid of the black leather briefcase. Inside, it wasn't chaotic. It was meticulously organized. A perfect reflection of a man who had spent 40 years systematically dismantling liars in a court of law. He pulled out a thick, heavy stack of documents securely bound by a large metal clip. There were no tears left in my eyes. There was only the crisp, sharp rustle of high-grade legal paper. 3 years ago, you thought I was being incredibly paranoid," Nolan said softly, laying the first document flat on the polished wood. It was the original promissory note, the one that outlined the massive $450,000 wire transfer to Stephen's failing shipping company. The dark blue ink of Stephen's frantic signature was clearly visible at the bottom. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. My father continued, his finger tracing the heavy text. I spent my entire career watching arrogant, entitled people assume their social status made them entirely immune to the consequences of their actions. Margaret and Stephen fall perfectly into that exact demographic. He pulled out a second stack of papers. This one bore the distinct, embossed seal of the state. It was the legal documentation for the $250,000 trust I had established just months ago for Assisi's extravagant wedding and future home. "They gladly took your money," Nolan said, looking directly into my eyes. But they completely failed to read the fine print. They were far too blinded by their own greed to see the steel trap they were eagerly stepping into. I stared at the dense, intimidating legal jargon. I had signed these papers trusting my father's judgment, but I had never actively studied the specific mechanisms he had embedded within them. I had always hoped, with foolish, naive optimism, that the heavy paperwork would just sit quietly in a dark vault forever. Now, I needed it to function perfectly as a lethal weapon. "Tell me exactly what we have," I demanded, my voice dropping to a harsh, focused whisper. "I want to know exactly how badly they just destroyed themselves." Nolan actually smiled. It was the cold, terrifying smile of a seasoned predator that had just cornered its prey. He tapped a specific paragraph highlighted in bold black ink. "They didn't just insult you, Celeste," he said calmly. "They legally defaulted." He pointed at the clause. Nolan smoothed out the heavily worded document. This is where the brilliant, cold logic of the law completely overtakes messy human emotion. When I drafted this promissory note, I included a very specific acceleration clause. Nolan explained, his tone shifting into full judicial mode. In standard finance, if a borrower misses a payment, the lender can legally demand the entire remaining balance immediately. But I didn't just tie this to missed payments. He tapped a heavily underlined section. I tied it to a moral turpitude and defamation covenant. It explicitly states that if the borrower or any immediate beneficiary of the trust engages in severe public defamation, malicious humiliation, or intentional emotional distress against you, the lender, the contract is breached. I stared at the words, the sheer brilliance of the trap finally clicking into place. Margaret publicly humiliated me in front of 200 people, and Stephen explicitly allowed it on tape. Exactly. Nolan nodded sharply. Which means the massive $450,000 loan, plus the $250,000 from the newly established trust, are no longer payable over 10 years. They are entirely due in full, immediately. My heart hammered a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. They don't have $700,000 in cash. Stephen's accounts are completely drained from paying the early wedding vendors. I know, Nolan replied calmly. He pulled out the final, most devastating piece of paper in the briefcase. It was an official, stamped property record. Which brings us to the collateral. He pushed the document toward me. When Stephen signed the original loan to save his ships, he didn't use the company as collateral. The bank already had claims on the fleet. He quietly used the only unencumbered asset the family had left. I looked down at the property address printed clearly on the form. It was the exact address of the sprawling Newport estate we were currently standing in. You hold the primary lien on this property. Celeste, Nolan stated, delivering the final, fatal blow. If they cannot produce $700,000 in cash within 24 hours of a declared breach, you legally own this mansion. They are essentially hosting $1 million wedding on your front lawn. The immense, staggering weight of the revelation washed over me. Margaret had called me a monster. She had tried to casually throw me out into the street. She had absolutely no idea she was actually the one facing imminent eviction. The heavy grandfather clock at the end of the hallway ominously chimed the hour. It was time for the main dinner service to begin. I looked at my father. Let's go to dinner. The grand hallway was completely empty, but the faint, muffled sounds of the elegant string quartet drifting from the ballroom signaled that the elite guests were finding their seats for the main reception. The toxic family inside was likely breathing a massive sigh of collective relief. Fully convinced I was already halfway down the driveway in a tearful retreat, I turned away from the console table and faced the large, gilded mirror hanging on the wall. I stared at my reflection. I was wearing a stunning, floor-length navy blue gown. Without the custom silk scarf, the severe raised burn scars on my left shoulder and collarbone were completely exposed to the harsh light. For 3 agonizing years in this house, I had viewed those marks through Margaret's cruel, judgmental eyes. I had treated them like a disgusting secret that needed to be aggressively hidden away to avoid offending their delicate, high society sensibilities. I reached out and lightly traced the rough, uneven skin with my fingertips. These scars were the exact reason 4 terrified people were still alive today. They were the undeniable, physical proof of my immense courage. Margaret's absolute disgust wasn't a reflection of my ugliness. It was a glaring spotlight on her own profound, moral emptiness. I turned to my father. He was carefully sliding the devastating legal documents into a sleek, cream-colored presentation envelope. He snapped the heavy briefcase shut and handed it to a passing valet, keeping only the envelope in his right hand. I looked down at Robert. The boy was staring up at me, his small hands still trembling slightly. I knelt down one last time, looking him directly in his worried brown eyes. "Robert," I said, my voice incredibly soft but entirely firm. "You have spent your whole life hiding from people who think they are better than you. You don't ever have to hide again." He swallowed hard. "Are you leaving?" "I am." I nodded honestly. "But I'm not running away. And I'm going to make sure you are safe before I go. Today, I will teach you exactly how to face down monsters." He didn't fully understand the complex legal warfare about to take place, but he understood the absolute safety in my tone. He nodded slowly, his small shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. I stood back up, adjusting the heavy fabric of my navy gown. I left the blue silk scarf sitting abandoned on the console table. It had been my shield for years, but I didn't need a shield to go to war. I just needed the truth. We are about to walk back into that ballroom. If you are ready for justice, drop a fire emoji below. Nolan stepped up beside me, offering his arm. I took it, my posture perfectly rigid. The heavy oak doors swung open. The music instantly died. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom did not simply open. They swung wide with a resounding thud that echoed over the elegant string quartet. I walked back into the blinding light of the chandeliers. I did not have my custom blue silk scarf. My left shoulder and collarbone were completely bare. The jagged, uneven burn scars were fully exposed for every single person in that massive room to see. I held my head high, my posture perfectly rigid, drawing on every ounce of military discipline I possessed. My father, Nolan, walked firmly on my right side. Young Robert walked on my left, his small, trembling hand gripped safely in mine. The music abruptly died. The lively chatter of 200 elite guests evaporated into a thick, suffocating silence. Every single eye in the room locked onto us. I could see the sudden shock rippling through the wealthy crowd. They had fully expected me to vanish into the night, nursing my profound humiliation in the shadows. Seeing me return, standing incredibly tall with my scars proudly displayed, completely short-circuited their high society expectations. Margaret was standing near the towering, multi-tiered wedding cake. She held a crystal flute of expensive champagne. When she saw me, her smug, victorious smile immediately faltered, quickly replaced by a mask of cold irritation. She scoffed loudly, clearly annoyed that her manufactured drama wasn't neatly finished. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Margaret snapped, her voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "Are we actually going to drag this out? Tell your father to stop indulging your little tantrums? Celeste, it is incredibly pathetic." Stephen stepped forward from the head table. His face was entirely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing directly on a live landmine. He raised both of his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. "Nolan, please," Stephen begged, his voice entirely desperate. "Let's not make a massive scene out of a simple misunderstanding. This is Assisi's wedding day. We can quietly discuss all of this tomorrow morning." Nolan didn't even blink. He looked at Stephen with the kind of absolute, chilling disgust usually reserved for something foul scraped off the bottom of a shoe. He didn't offer a single word in response. He simply walked past my panicked husband, navigating the polished dance floor with the slow, deliberate stride of a presiding judge entering his courtroom. The hired DJ, sensing the overwhelming tension, quickly backed away from his equipment station. Nolan stepped right up to the small podium. He placed the sleek, cream-colored presentation envelope down on the wooden surface. He reached out and adjusted the microphone. The entire ballroom held its breath. He tapped the microphone twice. "Good evening," Nolan began, his deep, resonant voice booming flawlessly through the high-end speakers. "My name is Nolan. Most of you in this room do not know me. I certainly did not come here tonight to give a traditional wedding toast." A nervous murmur rippled through the front tables. Assisi stood frozen near the massive floral archway, her expensive designer gown suddenly looking incredibly heavy. "I came here to celebrate the union of a new family," Nolan continued smoothly, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking directly onto Margaret. "But unfortunately, some illusions are simply too dangerous to be left completely unchecked." He opened the cream-colored envelope. He pulled out the first thick stack of papers, heavily marked with official notary seals. "This is a formalized legal trust," Nolan announced, holding the document up slightly. "It outlines a direct financial contribution of $250,000. Loud gasps echoed through the room. That was a staggering amount of cash, even for this wealthy zip code. That massive sum was entirely funded by my daughter, Celeste, Nolan stated with absolute, unshakable clarity. He adjusted his glasses, looking down at the detailed itemized list attached to the trust. "It specifically paid for the thousands of imported Dutch orchids you see around you. It paid for the Michelin-starred catering staff currently preparing your dinner. It even paid for the lovely string quartet sitting quietly in the corner. Assisi's jaw actually dropped. Her face flushed a violent, blotchy shade of crimson. She had spent the last 6 months loudly bragging to all of her elite friends about how her wealthy grandmother was throwing her the wedding of the decade. The absolute truth was completely devastating. "No," Assisi whispered, stepping back so quickly she nearly tripped over her massive train. Her expensive bridal bouquet slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a soft, pathetic thud. "That isn't true. My grandmother paid for this." "Your grandmother hasn't paid for anything in years," Nolan corrected gently, though the words carried lethal force. "Celeste insisted this money be treated as a quiet gift, simply because she wanted you to begin your marriage without crushing debt. Her only condition was that nobody ever needed to know." The crowd stared at me. The polite pity in their eyes had instantly transformed into profound, staggering respect. Margaret's face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. Her carefully constructed facade of untouchable wealth had just been publicly, utterly obliterated. She looked like she wanted to scream, but the undeniable physical proof was staring her right in the face. Stephen finally snapped out of his paralyzed stupor. Stephen reached for the microphone. "That is enough," Stephen shouted, his voice cracking horribly as he aggressively lunged toward the podium. "Nolan, you have made your point. Celeste, please, stop this right now." I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply walked over, gently took the microphone from my father's hand, and looked directly into Stephen's panicked eyes. "I am not making a scene. Stephen," I said smoothly. "I am simply setting the final record straight." "I was just trying to keep the peace," he pleaded, tears actually welling up in his eyes. He tried to look like a tragic, misunderstood victim. "I didn't want to hurt you. I thought she would just drop it. You have to believe me." "You didn't keep the peace, Stephen," I replied, the absolute coldness in my own voice surprising even me. "You just aggressively protected your own comfort." I looked out at the sea of wealthy guests. "An hour ago, your mother violently ripped this scarf from my neck. She called me a monster. And you stood there, holding your expensive bourbon, and told me to go hide so I wouldn't ruin the aesthetic." Stephen swallowed hard, visibly sweating under the intense glare of 200 people. "I panicked. I didn't know she was going to do it." "That is a complete lie," I stated, my words cutting through the air like a surgical scalpel. I turned slightly, gesturing toward Elena, the pale bridesmaid hiding in the back row. "I heard the audio recording from the bridal suite. Stephen, I heard your mother gleefully planning her little public execution. I heard you standing right beside her." A collective, horrified gasp swept through the elegant room. "You knew exactly what she was going to do," I continued, my voice perfectly steady. "You actually told her to wait until after the solo photographs were taken. You gave her your direct permission to publicly humiliate me, as long as it didn't disrupt your schedule." Stephen took a shaky step backward. There was absolutely no defense left. He was completely stripped bare. "The most painful wound today didn't come from Margaret," I said softly. "I always knew she was cruel. It came from the man who swore to protect me. I bought your failing shipping fleet, Stephen, but all the money in the world couldn't buy you a spine." The guests looked at Stephen with utter, unfiltered contempt. He had been thoroughly unmasked as a profound, cowardly failure. Margaret completely lost her mind. "You ungrateful, manipulative little outsider," Margaret shrieked, finally breaking her elite, high society composure. Her face was a mask of pure, ugly venom. "You are deliberately trying to destroy my family. You throw your dirty pension money around and think it buys you the right to ruin us." Nolan calmly took the microphone back from my hand. He didn't even look angry. He just looked deeply, professionally bored by her screaming. Celeste didn't just throw her money around, Nolan corrected smoothly. He reached back into the cream-colored envelope and pulled out the second, far more devastating document. She heavily invested it. And unfortunately for you, Margaret, she kept the receipts. He held up the crisp paperwork. It bore a massive, undeniable state seal. 3 years ago, Stephen's shipping empire was entirely bankrupt, Nolan announced loudly. Celeste executed a direct wire transfer of $450,000 to save his fleet from immediate bank foreclosure. The wealthy guests began whispering frantically. A few of Margaret's closest country club friends physically took a step away from her, as if sudden poverty was a highly contagious disease. But Stephen didn't use the ships as collateral for that massive loan. Nolan continued, his voice echoing relentlessly. He pointed to the thick property map attached to the document. He used the only unencumbered asset this family actually had left. He used this exact estate. Margaret froze. The screaming died in her throat. I drafted a specific acceleration clause in that legal contract, Nolan explained, delivering the financial execution flawlessly. It dictates that if the borrower engages in severe moral turpitude or public defamation against the lender, the entire debt becomes instantly due. Both the original $450,000 and the $250,000 from today's trust. He looked Margaret right in the eyes. Because of your vicious little stunt an hour ago, this family now owes Celeste $700,000 in cash, payable in exactly 24 hours. Nolan paused, letting the devastating reality sink in. If you cannot produce those funds, Celeste legally forecloses on this property. You do not own this estate. Margaret, you are currently hosting a lavish party on my daughter's front lawn. The absolute devastation on Margaret's face was spectacular. Her entire artificial empire had just been legally vaporized in front of her most important peers. She swayed slightly, desperately grabbing the edge of the cake table just to remain standing. A slick lawyer stepped forward. He was a tall, excessively groomed man in a custom-tailored Italian suit. He was the retained private attorney for Stephen's shipping firm, and he looked incredibly smug as he aggressively pushed his way to the front of the crowd. "Not so fast, Nolan," the slick lawyer interrupted, his voice dripping with condescending confidence. He turned to face the whispering guests, clearly eager to perform. "You might be a retired judge, but you are conveniently forgetting fundamental family law." My father didn't flinch. He simply raised one gray eyebrow. "Commingled marital assets," the lawyer declared loudly, smiling at Margaret. Her desperate eyes lit up with sudden, frantic hope. Since Celeste and Stephen are legally married, any funds transferred between them to sustain the family business are fundamentally considered a mutual marital contribution. There is absolutely no legally binding debt to repay here. The lawyer smirked, pointing a manicured finger at the paperwork in Nolan's hand. Furthermore, a punitive acceleration clause of that magnitude is completely unenforceable without an independent, third-party witness to verify the behavioral covenants. Your clever little trap is legally void. This property remains firmly with my clients. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Margaret instantly straightened her posture, a nasty, triumphant grin spreading across her face. Stephen actually let out a loud, pathetic sigh of relief. They honestly believed their expensive legal shield had just saved them from absolute ruin. I didn't even blink. I had known this exact moment was coming for 3 years. Nolan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply offered the lawyer a cold, deeply pitying smile. "An independent witness, you say?" Nolan asked quietly. He calmly flipped to the very last page of the dense promissory note. He placed it flat on the wooden podium, right under the bright spotlight, and tapped the bottom signature line with his heavy gold pen. "Perhaps you should verify whose signature currently occupies that exact line. Counselor?" The slick lawyer leaned in, squinting at the dark blue ink. His smug, confident smile vanished instantly. All the blood aggressively drained from his face, leaving him looking incredibly sick. 3 years ago, Stephen was entirely desperate. Nolan explained to the dead silent room. He blindly signed the loan, and Margaret, assuming it was just a standard tax waiver for her son, eagerly signed as the formal, independent guarantor. I looked at my mother-in-law. "You legally witnessed your own destruction, Margaret." The lawyer slowly backed away, completely defeated. Margaret stared at the undeniable signature, her mouth opening and closing without any sound. The trap had violently snapped shut, breaking every single bone in their defense. Her artificial empire finally collapsed. There were no dramatic, screaming matches left to be had. The incredibly expensive, slick lawyer quietly packed up his fine leather briefcase and slipped out the side door, knowing perfectly well that he was not getting paid for today's disastrous performance. Margaret stood completely frozen by the towering, multi-tiered wedding cake, her manicured hands trembling violently as she stared at the damning signature on the projector screen. Her artificial, glittering empire had just been legally vaporized in front of 200 of her most elite, judgmental peers. I didn't gloat. I didn't offer a final, biting remark or a triumphant laugh. True power doesn't require a theatrical closing monologue. I simply turned my back on the woman who had called me a monster. Nolan neatly gathered the devastating legal documents, sliding them back into his cream-colored envelope with the calm, methodical precision of a judge clearing his bench at the end of a long day. He offered me his arm one last time. I took it, holding my head incredibly high. I reached down with my free hand and firmly grasped Robert's small, warm fingers. We walked toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. As we moved, an incredible thing happened. The wealthy guests, the exact same people who had been quietly whispering about my terrible scars just an hour ago, silently parted to make way for us. They stepped back, clearing a wide, unobstructed path straight down the center of the room. Nobody looked at me with polite pity anymore. They looked at me with absolute, unfiltered awe. Behind us, the fragile illusion of their perfect family violently shattered. I could clearly hear Stephen's voice finally rising, aggressively yelling at Margaret for her careless arrogance. I could hear Assisi sobbing loudly about her ruined, expensive aesthetic. They were turning on each other, tearing their own toxic family apart exactly like a pack of starving wolves. I didn't slow my pace. I didn't look back to watch the pathetic carnage. We stepped out of the suffocating ballroom and walked straight out the front doors of the sprawling Newport mansion. The cool, salty ocean air immediately hit my face, incredibly fresh and intensely liberating. The heavy, invisible chains of my deep survivor's guilt were completely gone. I wasn't an ugly outsider, and I wasn't a convenient financial savior. I was just a woman who had finally remembered how to fly. Nolan led us to his waiting car. He opened the heavy door for Robert, who scrambled inside with a massive, genuine smile on his face. My father looked at me, his dark eyes shining with quiet, profound pride. "You did well, Celeste," he murmured softly. We drove away into the quiet night. I never looked back. The formidable machinery of the law moves with absolute, terrifying precision when it is properly unleashed. Over the next 12 months, the devastating legal fallout from that Newport wedding was entirely surgical and completely unyielding. Nolan had not been bluffing. True to the exact wording of the acceleration clause, the massive $700,000 debt was legally called in. Stephen, predictably, could not produce the cash. He attempted to hire 3 different defense attorneys to fight the ironclad promissory note in court. But the moment they saw Margaret's undeniable signature on the guarantor line, they all quietly declined the hopeless case. The primary bank aggressively moved in. Stephen's failing shipping fleet was officially seized, dismantled, and sold off in humiliatingly cheap pieces to his major competitors. His generational legacy was completely wiped off the maritime map. But the final, crushing blow landed a few months later. Because they fundamentally defaulted on my loan, I officially foreclosed on the sprawling Newport mansion. I didn't want to live in that toxic museum of fake prestige, so I simply handed the massive deed over to a high-end commercial real estate agency. They sold the heavily encumbered property to a wealthy foreign investor within weeks. Margaret was forcefully evicted from her own beloved fortress. The woman who had spent decades meticulously curating her elite social standing was abruptly forced to move into a tiny, remarkably plain two-bedroom apartment on the dusty outskirts of town. Her wealthy country club friends, the same women she used to drink fine tea with, instantly stopped returning her desperate phone calls. In their ruthless, image-obsessed world, financial failure is considered highly contagious. She was completely, utterly isolated. Stephen moved into a cheap motel near the old docks. The last I heard, he was spending his miserable days drinking heavy, cheap bourbon, endlessly blaming his mother for destroying his entire life. He completely refused to take any personal accountability for his own cowardly silence. He remained, to the very bitter end, a man entirely without a spine. I didn't feel sorry for them. I didn't feel angry at them anymore, either. They had simply become irrelevant, distant shadows of a past life I had successfully escaped. The divorce paperwork had been finalized quietly, without a single courtroom battle. Stephen had absolutely nothing left to fight with. I took the $700,000 I had recovered from the property sale and completely redirected my future. I stopped trying to fix broken, toxic people who actively hated me. Instead, I decided to invest in someone who actually mattered. I bought a helicopter. The sky above the sprawling coastal airfield was a brilliant, endless blue. I sat comfortably in the pilot seat of the sleek, newly refurbished rescue helicopter, adjusting the dials on the control panel. Sitting in the co-pilot seat next to me was Robert. He was 13 now. The terrified, shaking boy who used to hide in the dark, dusty corners of the Newport mansion was completely gone. He was currently wearing an oversized aviation headset, tapping the glass gauge and confidently reading off the wind speed metrics. He lived with me full-time now. The family courts had heavily favored my stable environment over Stephen's bankrupt, chaotic reality. Robert was thriving. I had used the recovered trust money to open a specialized aviation academy for at-risk youth. We taught teenagers who had been neglected or discarded by the system how to properly fly, how to navigate complex mechanical systems, and fundamentally, how to trust themselves again. It was a rigorous, demanding program, but it actively saved lives. One crisp Tuesday morning, a hesitant knock echoed at the academy's front office door. I walked out and found a Cece standing there. She looked remarkably different. She wasn't wearing an expensive designer gown or flashing heavy diamond jewelry. She wore plain denim jeans and a simple cotton sweater. The arrogant, entitled glare she had always worn like a crown was entirely absent, replaced by a deep, weary humility. Her wealthy real estate husband had immediately filed for divorce the moment her family's financial ruin became public knowledge. "Celeste," she whispered, her voice incredibly quiet. "I know I don't have any right to be here. I know what I did." I didn't invite her in. I stood in the doorway, my posture straight, waiting for her to finish. "I have nothing left," Assisi admitted, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "My mother won't speak to me. Stephen is completely gone. I wanted to apologize. For the wedding, for the scarf, for absolutely everything." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I want to apply for the volunteer janitorial position here at the academy. I want to learn how to actually work." I looked at the 22-year-old girl. I could have easily slammed the door in her face. I had every legal and moral right to turn her away. But I looked at Robert, smiling out on the tarmac, and realized that holding on to bitter grudges only poisons your own soil. The shifts start at 5 in the morning. Assisi, I said calmly. If you are late once, you are gone. Do you understand? She nodded frantically, profound relief flooding her tired face. I understand. Thank you. She walked away, carrying a mop. I walked out of the busy academy office and headed straight for the open tarmac. The loud, rhythmic chopping sound of the helicopter blades slowly spinning up filled the crisp morning air. Robert was already giving me a massive thumbs up from the cockpit, absolutely ready for our daily coastal patrol flight. Before climbing into the pilot's seat, I paused and caught my own reflection in the polished glass of the cockpit door. I was wearing a sleeveless, practical flight suit. My left shoulder and collarbone were fully exposed. The thick, jagged burn marks and the aggressive shrapnel lines were clearly visible in the bright sunlight. For years, I had allowed Margaret and her toxic, image-obsessed family to convince me that these scars were a hideous deformity. I had spent countless hours desperately hiding them, thoroughly convinced that my past trauma made me unworthy of genuine love. I reached out and touched the raised skin. They weren't a symbol of a monster. They were the undeniable, physical map of a survivor. They were the absolute proof that when the world caught fire, I didn't run away. I walked directly into the flames, and I pulled people out. I reached into my deep flight pocket and pulled out the piece of fabric I had kept hidden for over a year. It was the custom navy blue silk scarf. The exact same scarf Margaret had violently torn from my neck in that suffocating Newport ballroom. I didn't wrap it around my neck. I didn't use it to hide my skin. Instead, I carefully tied it around the heavy metal control stick of the helicopter. I secured it with a tight, unbreakable knot. As the powerful engines roared to life and we slowly lifted off the ground, the blue silk whipped and fluttered wildly in the open cabin wind, waving like a vibrant flag of absolute victory. I finally understood the truth. The most brutal revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's stripping them of their power to hurt you and living a life so brilliantly bright they can never reach it. If this story reminded you of your own strength to walk away from a toxic environment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And thank you for flying with me. The end. We climbed into the sky.